Alright guys, I've been hearing a lot about fertilizing my plants every few weeks, but what happens if you don't do that? What if you just completely stop fertilizing for 2 whole months? Well, today, we're testing it out. So, buckle up, cause we're about to find out. So here's the plan. About 2 months ago, I decided to do something that's kind of crazy in the plant world. I stopped fertilizing my plants. I know for some of you that sounds like the worst idea ever. But hear me out. I've always been told that fertilizing is essential for healthy plant growth, right? We're constantly bombarded with feed your plants every couple of weeks, give them a boost to help them grow faster and all that jazz. But what happens if you ignore that advice? What happens if you just let your plants do their thing and stop with the fertilizing altogether? I wanted to find out, so I decided to take a risk. I didn't apply any fertilizer, nothing at all, for 2 whole months. I didn't even add any compost or organic matter to the soil, just regular watering and sunlight, just the basics. Now of course I didn't want to neglect them completely. I still watered my plants like usual and made sure they got the light they needed, but no extra nutrients. Just plain, no fuss care. At first it felt kind of wrong? Like, what if my plants started turning yellow? What if they started dropping leaves? What if they just completely withered away? I mean, we've all heard those horror stories, right? But I figured, hey, let's see how they handle it. After all, plants grow in the wild without anyone coming around every few weeks and feeding them a fancy fertilizer. Why should my plants be any different? To make sure the experiment was fair, I didn't just pick random plants. I chose a mix of everything. Some plants that were pretty sturdy and had been thriving for a while, and others that were a little more delicate and needed more care. This way, I'd get a solid idea of how different plants react to going without fertilizer. The variety was important because not all plants are the same, and I wanted to test that theory. Do all plants need constant feeding, or are some okay with just water and light? The first thing I noticed when I stopped fertilizing was how quiet everything got. Usually I'm used to seeing plants visibly reacting to the nutrients with their leaves getting bigger and brighter or their stems growing stronger. But now, they weren't growing at the same pace. It was subtle, but it was there. I started to wonder, was the fertilizer really giving them that much of a boost? Or were they just fine without it? So, by the time we hit the 1-month mark, I was starting to feel a little more comfortable. The plants weren't dead, but they definitely didn't look as healthy as they had before. The growth had slowed down a lot. There was a visible difference in some of the plants, especially the ones that had been growing really fast before I stopped fertilizing. The leaves were still green, but they were smaller than before, and the stems weren't as strong. I started wondering, was I doing more harm than good, or was this just a part of the plant's natural cycle? I mean, in nature, plants don't have people fertilizing them every month, right? They get their nutrients from the soil, from the environment, and they just adapt to whatever they're given. But now that I was in this experiment, I had to face the reality that maybe I had been overcompensating with all the extra fertilizers and not giving my plants enough credit for being tough and adaptable. It was definitely starting to look like the plants could live without the constant fertilizing. But would they thrive? That was the million-dollar question. So, now we're a month into this experiment, and by this point, things are starting to get a bit more interesting. I had figured that the plants might slow down, but honestly, I didn't expect the changes to be quite as noticeable as they were. At first, everything seemed fine. The leaves were still green, the plants weren't wilting, and there weren't any major signs of stress. It felt almost like the plants were giving me a thanks for the break vibe. They weren't demanding anything extra, but that's when I realized it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. One of the first things I noticed was the growth. It definitely slowed down. In the past, when I was regularly fertilizing, I could see noticeable growth within a week. My plants would shoot up with new leaves or get noticeably fuller, but now, they weren't growing at the same pace. The new shoots were smaller and weaker than I remembered, and the older leaves were just hanging out, not getting any bigger or more vibrant. It was almost like my plants were on a slow-mo setting, just doing their thing but at a slower pace. Then, I started seeing the first signs of what I can only describe as fading. The leaves, which once had this lush, vibrant green color, were starting to look a little dull. Not yellowing yet, but definitely not as bright as before. They had this slightly worn-out appearance, like they were tired, and honestly I was starting to get worried. It wasn't huge, but I could tell that they weren't thriving the way they used to. And remember, I'm still just watering them regularly, giving them the sunlight they need, but I wasn't giving them any extra boosts from fertilizer. This led me to think about the balance between water, light, and nutrients. Was water enough? Was light enough? It was clear that, while plants can survive with the basics, they weren't thriving without the extra help. I mean, think about it. When you're giving a plant the perfect combination of water, sunlight, and nutrients, it's like giving it the best possible conditions to grow. But without that extra push from fertilizer, the plants were still alive, but they weren't exactly flourishing the way they could have been. Now, I didn't want to jump to conclusions too early, but I had to be honest with myself. The plants were still holding on, but I could tell something was off. The ones that I considered tougher plants, the ones that had already been growing strong for a while, seemed to be doing better than the more delicate ones. The succulents, for example, were still looking okay. Their leaves were holding their shape and color, and they didn't seem to miss the fertilizer at all. But my ferns? The ferns were starting to show signs of stress. Their leaves were a little droopy, and the edges of some of the fronds had started turning brown. It was subtle, but it was there. And here's the kicker. Some of my plants were showing the first signs of nutrient deficiencies. The leaf tips started to turn a little yellow, especially in the plants that had been producing new growth before the experiment. Those younger leaves were struggling more than the older ones. That's when it hit me. Maybe plants need fertilizer more than I realized, especially when they're growing fast or need a little extra care. They weren't dying, but they certainly weren't thriving. And it was clear that without that extra support, their growth was taking a hit. But, on the flip side, I also realized something else. Some of my hardier plants, the ones that are more low maintenance, like the succulents, cacti, and some of my hardier houseplants, looked like they were doing just fine. It was almost like they were shrugging off the whole fertilizing thing like it wasn't a big deal. They were still growing at their own pace, not much different from how they looked when I first got them. These plants were adapting, surviving, and maybe even thriving with minimal attention. It was as if they were designed for this kind of treatment. Simple, basic care, and they were happy to make it work. Okay, so now we're into month 2, and this is where the real drama started to unfold. By the time we hit the 2-month mark, things were starting to look, well, a little rough for some of the plants. The plants that were doing okay during the first month had now begun showing some more serious signs of nutrient deficiency. The leaves were starting to lose their luster. Some of the older leaves were turning yellow. This wasn't just the tips. Whole sections of the leaves were losing their vibrant green. For a plant parent, that's always a major red flag. I mean, when you see your plant's leaves fading from green to yellow, it's like the plant is telling you it's hungry, very hungry. At first I thought, okay, this could be just a little phase, maybe they're adjusting. But after a few weeks I started noticing the yellowing getting worse. And not just on the older leaves either. The new growth, the ones that had been growing in the first month when I wasn't fertilizing, was now showing signs of distress. Those fresh tiny leaves, which would normally be lush and vibrant, were starting to look weak. Their growth was stunted, and instead of that healthy green color they were tinged with a pale yellow, which told me the plant wasn't getting enough nutrients, especially the nitrogen it needs for healthy leaf development. This was the moment when I really started questioning my experiment. Was this the point where I'd made a mistake? Should I have been fertilizing them the entire time? The plants were still alive, but they weren't flourishing like they should be. And that's when I realized fertilizer isn't just a luxury for plants. It's an essential part of the process if you want them to grow strong, vibrant, and healthy. While it's true that some plants, like succulents, are more self-sufficient, the majority of plants, especially those that are more active growers, really need those nutrients to maintain their health and vitality. But wait, before I go into full panic mode, let's talk about the ones that were still doing okay. The succulents and cacti, these guys, they were still thriving. No yellowing, no wilting, no nutrient deficiencies. It was like they were laughing at me the entire time, saying, "You think we need fertilizer? Ha, we don't need any of that." They were still looking strong, their leaves plump and vibrant, and they were growing slowly but steadily. These plants were definitely making it clear that not all plants need the same level of care. The interesting thing, though, was that even the succulents, which were surviving just fine without the fertilizer, didn't look quite as good as they did when I was consistently fertilizing them. Their leaves were still plump, but they didn't have that same rich, deep color. It was as if they were just getting by, not thriving. I could see that, for them, fertilizing was like giving them an extra boost to take them from doing okay to doing amazing. And without that extra help, they were doing fine but not in their prime. So, now that the 2-month experiment is over, let's break down what we've learned. The results are in, and honestly, I've got a lot to share with you. If you've been following along with this whole thing, you've seen that skipping fertilizer for 2 months wasn't a complete disaster, but it wasn't all smooth sailing either. There were definitely some major takeaways, and I think I've learned a ton about how plants react to different levels of care. First off, I have to say, I was pretty impressed by how resilient plants can be. Even without all the fancy fertilizers, some of my plants were able to survive, and I'd even say they were doing pretty okay. The succulents and cacti, for example, were completely chill the entire time. Their leaves stayed plump and firm, their color stayed vibrant, and they just kept growing at their own pace. It really made me realize that these plants are built for tough conditions. They're adapted to dry, nutrient-poor environments, and they don't need all that extra care to survive. In fact, they probably don't want all that extra care, and they're perfectly happy living with minimal intervention. That being said, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. While some plants were thriving, others were showing clear signs that they did need fertilizer. My ferns, for instance, they were definitely struggling. The leaves were wilting, turning yellow, and getting brown edges. This kind of stress is usually a sign that the plant's not getting enough nutrients, particularly nitrogen, which is essential for leaf growth. So, for these types of plants, going 2 months without fertilizer definitely wasn't a good idea. It wasn't life-threatening, but it definitely caused them to lag in terms of growth and health. The same goes for my leafy greens. I had a few indoor plants that I usually fertilize regularly, and without that extra boost, their growth slowed down significantly. I saw fewer new leaves, and the ones that did sprout didn't have that same healthy, rich green color. They looked a little sickly and weak, just a shadow of their former selves. And while these plants weren't dying, they were absolutely not thriving without that nutritional support. They really needed the fertilizer to fuel their growth. So here's the big revelation from this whole experiment. Not all plants need fertilizer the same way. Some plants, particularly the hardy, low-maintenance ones like succulents and cacti, can go long stretches without it and still do great. On the other hand, the more delicate plants, the ones that are actively growing, putting out new leaves or producing flowers, need those extra nutrients to maintain their health and vitality. Skipping fertilization for 2 months was a little too much for those plants. They showed clear signs of nutrient deficiencies, and without fertilizer, their growth was stunted. I also realized that fertilizing isn't just about making your plants grow faster. It's about ensuring they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. You can think of it like this. When you give your plants the right balance of nutrients, you're setting them up for long-term health. Without it, you might be getting by, but your plants won't reach their full potential. It's not just about survival, it's about optimal growth. Another important lesson I learned is that plants have different nutrient needs depending on their life stage. For example, when plants are actively growing, they require more nutrients to support that rapid growth. But when they're in a dormant phase or growing slowly, they don't need as much. So, while skipping fertilization for 2 months worked for some of my plants, it was clear that others would have benefited from more consistent feeding during this time. So, what do we take away from this experiment? Well, I think the biggest lesson is that you don't have to follow a strict fertilizing schedule for every plant. Some plants can do just fine with minimal care, while others really depend on that extra boost to keep them healthy. Fertilizing should be customized to each plant's needs and growth stage, and it's important to pay attention to your plants. If they're growing strong and healthy, maybe they don't need as much. But if they're looking a little stressed, yellowing, or not growing as quickly as usual, it might be time to give them a little extra love. So, the bottom line, fertilizing your plants can make a huge difference, especially for those that are more delicate or actively growing, but some plants can absolutely survive without it for a while. It's all about finding that balance and understanding the specific needs of each plant. And of course, if you're ever in doubt, you can always ease up on the fertilizing routine a little bit and see how your plants respond. Just remember, don't go too long without checking in on them. Alright, that's it for today's experiment. I hope you guys found this helpful, and if you did, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts or questions, and subscribe for more plant care tips. Keep growing, and I'll catch you in the next one.